I have a note up here to remind myself that every year the Impact Church, which represents lots of folks downtown, gathers up school supplies for the children there, and we always participate in that. And normally they bring children here, and we have signed up to take those children somewhere and buy the school supplies for them. And we always have more than enough people to sign up to do that. However, under these strange conditions that we live in, they're not able to bring the kids down here, and we're not able to take them out shopping. And so they've asked that we make a contribution to help the children buy those school supplies. And today is the deadline for those supplies, for donations for those supplies. And surprisingly, we're only about halfway there. It's about $90 per child, and we normally take about 50 children. And so if you would like to, just a little reminder, if you would like to make a donation, whatever that donation is, it doesn't have to be $90, but whatever donation you would like to make, and put a little note on it that says Impact School Supplies or something to that effect, and we'll add it to that. So just a reminder. I don't think we've ever undertaken something that we didn't go over the top on, so let's make sure that we do that again this year. Thank you. And I had to smile at Nathan talking about the little squiggly thing, QR code. I wouldn't know that except I looked it up 3 or 4 times. I'd forget 2 or 3 times during the week after I looked it up. I forgot what it was. So I looked it up 2 or 3 times. And I know that most people, 99% of the people, are a lot more literate with their computer and phone than I am. And Nathan said, point your phone at it. Well, you have to turn it on and turn your camera on first before you point your phone at it. All right. And I think we have about 3 of those now, so you can have one that will come up on the screen and that will take you to our bulletin today. We have another one that will take you to information on our website, so that if you'd like to tell us that you're listening in somewhere, we have people from around the world that are listening in, and we'd like to hear feedback from you. And so there'll be another QR code for that. And now we have this one. If you're visiting with us, then we have a virtual visitor's card that will take you to a site, and you just fill that information out. So we're really getting high tech around here. I'm impressed. I can't even imagine how you make one of those things up, but I just went to one of the secretaries and said, can we make one of those little squiggly things to do so-and-so? Yeah, no problem. And 30 minutes later it's done. So I don't know how we do this, but we are. So it's interesting times we live in. And we got plenty of space for people to spread out today. And we have one more, I think it'll probably be announced, but one more additional COVID case. So these are really, really interesting times that we live in. And we need to be reminded, if you're like me, I need to be reminded to keep my focus on the right things, because there are opportunities that exist right now that we don't always have, and we need to be aware of them. I think most Bible students have a few concepts that forever intrigue us. Maybe it's a question that you have. Maybe it's an idea. Maybe it's a phrase. Maybe it's a principle that stays in the back burner of our minds. And it's kind of like a puzzle, that we're always alert for pieces that will help us understand better that idea or that principle or that concept or that question that we might have. And as we read and study our Bibles, we encounter things that might be a piece of that puzzle. And so we've got this thing burning in the back of our brain, maybe a question or whatever, and we run across something, we think, I wonder if that fits in here. And so we take that piece of puzzle and we see if we can fit it in, see if it helps us understand that. I have a few of those statements or questions that intrigue me and challenge my thinking constantly, and they never go away completely. And one of them is a phrase, they just kind of catch your fancy maybe. One of them is the phrase that the writer of the Hebrews in Hebrews 8 quotes from Jeremiah 31. And these are phrases that the ones that intrigue me are ones that we all are familiar with. It's where God is talking about He's going to give a new covenant to His people. And He says, and this new covenant's not going to be like the old one. He said, in this new covenant, I will put my law in their mind and I will write it on their hearts. That phrase intrigues me. I will put my law in their mind. That's what you think about. And I will write it on their hearts. That's what you desire. That's your will, what you want to accomplish. And God's talking about us in this new covenant and the relationship that He'll have with us in this covenant and what the relationship that we'll have with His Word. He said, I'll put my law in their minds, in their thoughts. That's what they'll be thinking about all the time. And I will write it on their hearts. They will come to the point, they not only think about it all the time, but it's what they want to do. And that's what consumes people. And then He says, I'll be their God and they'll be my people. Whenever my people think about me and my law and my word all the time, and they really, the primary desire of their heart is they want to please me, and then He said, I'll be their God and they'll be my people. But that's not the one I want to look at this morning. There's another one that's quoted in the New Testament that originated in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, the setting is that Paul was preaching on his first missionary journey, and he was in Pisidian Antioch in Acts chapter 13, and he's giving the folks there a Cliff's Notes version of Israel's history. And in his speech, in his lesson, he's already gone through the Exodus, and he's gone through the wandering, he's gone through the Judges, and now he's to the period of the Kings. And he says, after removing Saul, He made David their king. And He testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. Well, that's another one of those phrases that catches my fancy. And I think the reason that both of these concepts fascinate me so much is because I want both of these things to be true about me. I want to have God's law written on my heart, and I want it to be in my mind. And I want God to be able to look at me and say, there's a man after my own heart. And I think that's why they intrigue me so much, and that those things are always on the back burner of my mind, and I run across things from time to time that may be a piece of the puzzle that fits in one of those, and say, I wonder if that completes, that helps me understand exactly what that means. And so this morning I want to share with you what I believe is a piece of the puzzle, and frankly, it's not necessarily something that you don't know, but maybe something that we need to be reminded of. You know, sometimes we say, well, it goes without saying so-and-so and so-and-so, and sometimes we go without saying so long that we let it kind of slip away from our thinking, and we need to say it. And so, just listen for a minute. The youngest son of any family bears two distinctions. He's considered to be both spoiled and uninformed. Usually little is expected of him. Inevitably, he displays fewer characteristics of leadership than the other children in the family. As a child, he never leads, he only follows, for he has no one younger on whom to practice leadership. So it is today, and so it was 3,000 years ago in a village called Bethlehem, in a family of 8 boys. The first 7 sons of Jesse worked near their father's farm. The youngest was sent on treks into the mountains to graze the family's small flock of sheep. On those pastoral jaunts, this youngest son always carried 2 things: a sling, and a small guitar-like instrument. Spare time for a sheep herder is abundant on rich mountain plateaus where sheep can graze for days in one sequestered meadow. But as time passed and days became weeks, the young man became very lonely. The feeling of friendlessness that always roamed inside of him was magnified. He often cried. He also played his harp a great deal. He had a good voice, so he also sang. When those activities failed to comfort him, he gathered up a pile of stones, and one by one, he swung them at a distant tree with something akin to fury. When one rock pile was depleted, he would walk to that blistered tree and reassemble his rocks and designate yet another leafy enemy at a further distance. He engaged in many such solitary battles. This shepherd, singer, slinger also loved his Lord. At night, when all the sheep lay sleeping and he stared at the dying fire, he would strum upon his harp and break into quiet song. He sang the ancient hymns of his forefathers' faith. And while he sang, he wept. And while weeping, he often broke out in abandoned praise, until mountains in distinct places lifted up his praise and tears and passed him on to higher mountains until they eventually reached the ears of God. And when the young shepherd did not praise, and when he did not cry, he tended to each and every sheep and lamb. When not occupied with his flock, he swung his companionable sling and swung it again and again until he could tell every rock precisely where to go. Once, while singing his lungs out to God, angels, sheep, and passing clouds, he spied a living enemy, a huge bear. He lunged forward. Both found themselves moving furiously toward the same small object, a lamb feeding at a table of rich green grass. Youth and bear stopped halfway and whirled to face one another. Even as he instinctively reached into his pocket for a stone, the young man realized, "Why, I'm not afraid." Meanwhile, brown lightning on mighty furry legs charged at the shepherd with foaming madness. Impelled by the strength of youth, the young man married rock to leather, and soon a brook-smooth pebble whined through the air to meet that charge. A few moments later, the man, not quite so young as a moment before, picked up the little lamb and said, "I am your shepherd, and God is mine." And so, long into the night, he wove the day's saga into a song. He hurled that hymn to the skies again and again until he taught the melody and the words to every angel that had ears. And then, in turn, they became custodians of this wondrous song and passed it on as healing balm to heartbroken men and women in every age to come. And maybe you know that song. The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me down to lie in pastures green. He leadeth me in pastures green. He leadeth me. In fact, I looked it up in our book, and that song that David wrote, we still have it with us today in 3 different tunes in our songbook. and there are many more, I'm quite confident. In fact, it struck me as interesting that every one of the 3 tunes that we have written in our book were actually written in the 1850s and 1860s. Maybe it's time for somebody to put a new tune to it and have a new song. What I just gave you was chapter 1 from one of my all-time favorite little books entitled A Tale of 3 Kings by Gene Edwards. And so I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 3. Listen again. David sang to the mad king often. The music helped the old man a great deal, it seems. And all over the palace, when David sang, everyone stopped in the corridors, turned their ears in the direction of the king's chamber, and listened and wondered, how did such a young man come to possess such wonderful words and music? Everyone's favorite seemed to be the song of the little lamb. They loved that song as much as did the angels. Nonetheless, the king was mad, and therefore he was jealous. Or was it the other way around? Either way, Saul felt threatened by David, as kings often do when there's a popular, promising young man beneath them. The king also knew, as did David, that this boy just might have his job someday. But would David ascend the throne by fair means or foul? Saul did not know. The question is one of the things that drove the king mad. David was caught in a very uncomfortable position. However, he seemed to grasp a deep understanding of the unfolding drama into which he had been caught. He seemed to understand something that few of even the wisest men of his day understood, something that in our day, when men are perhaps wiser still, even fewer understand. And what was that? God did not have, but wanted very much to have, men and women who would live in pain. God wanted a broken vessel. God first uttered this statement about David, that he had found David to be a man after his own heart in 1 Samuel 13. Saul had just finished presumptuously offering a sacrifice to God that was supposed to have been offered by the prophet-priest Samuel, but Samuel was late. Samuel had set a date and said, I'll be there to offer a sacrifice, and Saul's army was facing an army of far, far superior forces. In fact, Saul only started out with 2,000 himself. His son, Jonathan, had 1,000 somewhere else. But as the days went on, and as Samuel didn't show up at the appointed time, even those 2,000 were abandoning him. And the Bible tells us that his enemy had 3,000 chariots. And each chariot had 2 charioteers, and so that was 6,000 charioteers. And then it says, and the footmen were as numerous as the sands on the seashore. And so here he is with his little ragtag army abandoning him. And so he finally decides, I can't go into battle without consulting God and offering a sacrifice. And Samuel hasn't showed up. So he offered the sacrifice himself. And when Samuel finally does arrive, Saul is just finishing his sacrificial offering. And he comes up to Saul and he says, what have you done? And following his explanation, Samuel says, you've acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. And you know, it occurs to me as I think about this, and I've read it just like you have many, many times, but it occurs to me that a big part of faith is learning to wait on the Lord. and not taking things into your own hand and not thinking that everything depends on you. A big part of faith is learning to wait and let the Lord take care of the situation. But even with all of this, it occurs to me that David was not an ideal candidate. If you'll remember with me in 1 Samuel 21, while he was fleeing from Saul, he needed something to eat and the men with him, and he didn't have a weapon, and so he went into a priest that he knew that lived there, Ahimelech, to get him to help him. And the result of that was that after Ahimelech had helped him, David lied to him in order to get his help. And the result of that was that Ahimelech and his family and 85 priests and their wives and their children and all of their animals were slaughtered because David lied. And then not long after that, while he was running from Saul, he pretended to be this slobbering, foam-at-the-mouth idiot while he was hiding with the Philistines in chapter 21. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 6, he ordered the Ark of the Covenant to be moved on an ox cart, and that resulted in Uzz's death. And then in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, the coup de grace, he committed adultery and murdered Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite. And the consequences of that act were phenomenal. Samuel came to him on behalf of the Lord, and he said, "The sword will not depart from your house." His son Amnon raped his daughter Tamar, and David didn't do anything about it. Why? Well, I suspect because sin compromises you. How are you going to tell somebody that it's wrong to do something when you've done that and worse yourself? And that's a problem in many homes today. The reason that parents can't properly discipline children is because a child can turn and say, "Why would you say that to me when you've done this and this and this? How can you tell me to do that?" And so sin compromises you. It robs you of authority, even in our own home. And then his son Absalom killed Amnon. Later, his son Solomon will kill his brother Adonijah in 1 Kings 2. And then God sent word to David, and he said, "Because of your sin, I will give your wives to your neighbor." And so in 2 Samuel 16, Absalom in his rebellion took some of his father's concubines and lay with them on the top of a tent in the view of the whole city. And then in 2 Samuel chapter 12, as a result of that adultery and that murder, his infant child dies immediately. And so I ask you the question, was David more righteous than Saul? Well, I'll let you answer that for yourself. But how would you feel if you knew somebody who deliberately killed a man so that he could have his wife? But God didn't say he chose David because he was righteous. What did he say? Well, in Paul's words in the New Testament, God testified concerning him, "I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to." And what had God said was Saul's problem? 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 11, God told Samuel, "I'm grieved that I've made Saul king because he has turned away from following me and has not carried out my commandments." So I'm going to draw a conclusion here. When God refers to someone as being after my own heart, he's saying somebody who'll follow me wherever I take him without changing my instructions. Even when he's being pursued by King Saul and the army of his own people trying to take his life, I think personally the most impressive thing that David ever did, maybe other than going up against Goliath as a young man, I think to me the most impressive thing he ever did was his repeated refusal to allow his men to kill Saul when God delivered him into his hand. God had already told him he was going to be king, and in order to be king, then Saul's going to have to be taken out of the way, and God more than one time delivered Saul into his hand, and all he had to do was just give a nod, and he had men that would take Saul out, didn't he? But he said, I will not lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. I'll wait on the Lord and let the Lord pick the time. Let the Lord take care of this problem. Could God have taken Saul out and installed David as king without all of those months of pain and distress and insecurity and agony of being pursued? David himself was said, so that he despaired of life and felt that there is but a step between me and death. Out before all this took place and put David on the throne? We all know the answer to that, right? Well, why didn't he? Why did he make David go through all of that time? And I think the answer is because in every one of us there's some stuff that can only be removed by pain, heartache, and insecurity. By realizing times in our life when it's obvious I'm not in control. It's all out of my control. And some of that stuff that's inside of us that needs to be removed and can only be removed by hardship, difficulty, and pain, maybe it's some anger that we feel. Or maybe it's this fierce independence that we have that kind of pushes God to the side. Or maybe it's our pride. Or maybe it's our security that we gain because we got money in the bank, because we got a house paid for, because we got a nice car, because of the security that we get from things. And I think of what David had that he lost during this time that he was being pursued. He had a safe home, didn't he? He had a future that he viewed for himself, whatever that might have been. He came to have a position of fame in Saul's army, so much so that all of the maidens made up a song about him. Now, how heady is that for a young man? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And they're singing that song as he marches around, goes around the city. And maybe he lost an ideal view of what God's leader was as he watched Saul and experienced his pursuit. You know, a few people will maintain their faith during times of painful trial. But if it lasts very long, most won't. Most of us will try to take matters into our own hands, or we'll quit, or we'll curse God and die. And so the question that I ask myself in preparation for this lesson is, like you, that I struggle somewhat to keep my focus in the right place during times such as this. My question is, will you be faithful in the wilderness of your life when things are out of your control? The only place where you can truly learn to trust God is in the wilderness, when you don't have your stuff that gives you security. And when you come out of the wilderness, you don't have to win all the fights anymore. You don't have to be the first. You don't have to get even. You don't throw spears anymore. You don't have to be in control. You don't have to determine what the outcome is going to be. You don't have to make anybody do anything. You don't even have to live. There's only one thing you must do. That is, do everything He tells you to do without adjusting it for whatever reason, without second-guessing Him like Saul did. I mean, if you stop and think about what Saul's violation of God's will was, boy, I can see myself there. Do what God says regardless of the cost, even when you can't understand why this is happening. And then you will be a man after God's own heart. Somewhere along the way, David learned about God. Some of it he learned during the long nights under the stars, tending sheep. Some of it he learned from his successes as a young man empowered by God, the lion, the bear, Goliath. Some of it he learned from his time in the wilderness when he was running from Saul. And some of it he learned from his mistakes and the consequences that came. He learned about God's power, and he learned about God's righteousness, and he learned about God's love. And he put words to his faith. The Lord is my shepherd. I will not lack anything. And so, is the Lord your shepherd? Truly. Do you trust Him? Are you willing to wait on Him for Him to determine the outcome? If He is, then live like it. And if He's not, how's that working for you? Come unto me, all you who are weary and carry a heavy burden, and I will give you rest, while we stand and sing.